Okay, good afternoon. My name is Sharon Gaskins, and I'm here at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. Welcome to this webinar on the 20% set-aside application for Title I, Part A. Before we dig in, I would love to make sure that everybody who's on the webinar can hear me. So if you could, take out a quick moment and just write in your chat box something like okay or I can hear you, just to make sure before we dig in. Great, thank you. So we'll get started. Okay, so first I'll start with an overview of the 20% set aside. By way of background, for those who do not know, DC was granted a waiver to the ESEA, the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, by the Department of Education back in July 2012. And that waiver was amended just recently this year in 2015. And in our waiver, DC committed to ensure that low-performing schools would receive the resources and supports needed to improve student outcomes. This 20% set-aside requirement aims to ensure that LEAs provide the funds necessary to meet the needs for priority and focus schools in particular. Which LEAs must set aside these 20% funds? Well, two types of LEAs. First, LEAs that have priority schools that are in the second year of implementation, the second year of identification or beyond, also known as schools that are in the implementation phase. LEAs with these schools must take the 20% set aside. And similarly, LEAs that have focus schools at in any year of implementation must also take the 20% set aside. And it's important to note that if an LEA has schools in multiple categories, both in the priority category and in the focus category, it is still required to set aside 20% of its funds. Okay, so 20% is the requirement no matter how many schools you have within priority or focus school status. So we're going to cover three main buckets of information for this webinar. First, we'll talk a bit about the intervention strategies that are required for priority and focus schools. Then we'll talk about what the application looks like within the Enterprise Grants Management System, or EGMS. And lastly, we'll talk about the application review process. So first, on those intervention strategies. Per requirements for the United States Department of Education, all priority schools must align their interventions with the 7 turnaround principles. Focus schools should lead activities aligned with the turnaround principles, but for their focus subpopulations in particular. These principles represent best practices in accelerating student achievement. And now here I'll just provide a quick overview of the turnaround principles. School leadership, which requires that schools ensure that the principal has the ability to lead a turnaround effort and a past track record of success and operational flexibility. Effective staffing, ensuring that teachers utilize research-based effective instruction to meet the needs of all students. The effective use of time, which involves the redesign of time and schedule to better meet the needs of students and increasing student-teacher collaboration focused on improving teaching and learning. Rigorous curriculum, which requires that teachers have the foundational documents and instructional materials they need to really teach to the rigors of the Common Core. Effective use of data, which involves ensuring the school-wide use of data focused on improving teaching and learning, as well as focused on the improvement of climate and culture within a school. School climate and culture involves establishing school environments with a climate that's conducive to learning and a culture of high expectations for all students. And finally, effective family and community engagement, which involves increasing family and community engagement with a specific focus on academic learning. So again, these are the principles by which priority schools must focus their turnaround efforts, and focus schools that do have that one or even two subpopulations of students with a history of underperformance, they too must focus on these kind of core foundational principles when thinking about the types of interventions that can be funded with the 20% set aside. A little bit more about focus schools. We know they fall into two broad categories in terms of this focused population of students that must receive greater attention and focus. Students with disabilities is one subcategory of students. English language learners is a second, and then the other subgroup category is broad, and it could include students from different racial backgrounds, such as African American or Hispanic, or students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. It's likely if you're on this webinar, you know what, and you're a focus school, you know what your subgroup is. If not, feel free to reach out to us. My contact information is at the end of this webinar, and we'd be happy to provide you more information. But basically, suffice it to say, with the knowledge of your subpopulation in hand, your LEA is required to show what strategies you are implementing with a specific focus on that subpopulation of students. And to help you think through these strategies and to just get a better understanding of the 7 turnaround principles, we've created a resource that provides an overview of intervention strategies, both for priority schools and for focus schools. It's currently housed on our grants management website, and we encourage you to take a look at it and just familiarize yourself with it. At the end of this webinar, I'll provide you kind of the routing to this document and the link so you can access it for yourself. So now let's turn to the actual application structure within the grants management system. And I'm just going to focus all of us on a few key tabs. I'm sorry if it's not really easy to read. We tried our best. And it's likely really that most of you on this webinar are pretty familiar with the EGMS, but just in case, I wanted to walk through some key elements of this application. And so for those of you who've already logged on to the portion of the consolidated application dedicated to the 20% set aside, this page should look very familiar. The portion of the application, the CONAP, I guess I could call it, that's focused on the 20% set aside is the intervention strategies tab, and that's this top red circle. This is the main tab, and then the sub tab begins with the LEA status. On that tab, you'll see a few things. First, of course, you'll see some direction about what LEAs will be required to take this set aside. Then you'll see the list of priority and focus schools for 2015 and 16. And then way at the bottom of the tab, you'll see your LEAs required set aside. That's what we, just an example here at the bottom. And if any of this does not look clear in your EGMS application, again, feel free to reach out to us. And in the next tabs labeled Priority and Focus, you'll see a few things. First, you'll see that for each turnaround principle, there's a brief overview of examples of strategies that fall under that turnaround principle. And then you'll see a series of questions that aim to allow LEAs to summarize the planned use of their funds, the schools to be targeted with those funds, some backgrounds as to why that strategy was chosen, and information on who's leading the work around the strategy or strategies. And of course, we'll ask how many set-aside funds you're going to set aside for that particular intervention. And it's really very similar formats from the priority side to the focus side. And one thing I really do want to note is these words in red, that LEAs are not required to submit set-aside funds for all turnaround principles. We actually really encourage you to focus on those areas that you think will make the biggest difference in your school or schools. And the final tab I will just bring to your attention is the Set Aside Summary tab, which is the last tab within the row. In it, you'll find it automatically sums up all of your allocations for each section. And at the end, asks you to do two things. First is select the checkbox to just acknowledge, again, that you're setting aside funds for priority and focus schools. And then finally, just saving the page. If it doesn't allow you to save, if an error message comes up, that means that it's likely that you haven't set aside enough funds or set aside too many funds. We want to make sure that's our check to make sure you haven't over or under budgeted. So if you see an error message there, I'd encourage you to go back into each tab and just check your math. And then on to the budget. The broader budget under the Detailed Expenditures tab is as a portion of the broader budget for the consolidated application. What I just want to draw your attention to is under Program Activities, for those programs that are related to your set-aside, you're going to use one of the kind of circled program activity buckets that you see on your screen to, again, clearly show in that expenditure summary which funds are you using for those set-aside activities, be they focus activities for specific subgroups of students or priority activities aligned to those 7 turnaround principles. And you'll fill out a similar sheet across each cost category within EGMS. Okay, and finally, we'll talk a little bit about the application review process. So once your application for the 20% set aside is submitted, what happens to it? Well, each LEA application will be reviewed internally here within OSSE using a rubric that will rate the application based on the following areas. Alignment, which seeks to understand whether or not the strategies that are put forward in your application are aligned to the turnaround principles for priority schools or targeted to specific subgroups for focus schools. For evidence base, we really want to understand the evidence base your LEA has drawn from to identify and prioritize these strategies. And these can be, it can be an evidence base from your LEA's own work with the intervention and seeing success, or national best practice, but we do want to see that there is some kind of research base for the interventions you're choosing. Data, acknowledging or identifying what data do you believe shows the need for the chosen strategy. And finally, is the expenditure allowable per the Department of Education's guidelines. So just a few examples of how you might think through all of these requirements. If your LEA, for instance, plans to use funds to dedicate to teacher professional development in a priority school, we might encourage you to detail the kinds of professional development that will be provided and how it will really address the specific areas of need based on your school's data. Or if your focus school plans to develop a new data collection system with set-aside funds, we encourage you to be clear and really articulate why you think this strategy will improve student achievement, maybe broadly, and how it will impact the performance of the targeted subgroup in particular. So again, for those focus populations, we want to understand why it will make a real difference for that subpopulation in particular. Also on our website, you'll have an opportunity to access the rubric that we'll use to rate your application, just so you can get a sense of the questions we'll be asking and the type of feedback we may provide. Applications that partially meet the requirements of this rubric or do not meet the requirements of this rubric will be returned back to LEAs for revision. Okay, so at this point, I might pause to see if there are any questions or requests for clarity around the application or the review process. Okay, great. So seeing no questions at this time, that's the webinar. The information that I share throughout the webinar, the different resources and the rubric, can be found on our website. There is the path in our grants management policy and guidance portion of the website, and also the link. We will be sure to send out the PowerPoint you're seeing today and these links to you after this webinar. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me directly. My contact information is below. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye.